photos. It doesn't take much.
Welcome, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to the Planning Commission workshop for November 8th. And Ms. Reynolds, would you mind taking roll, please?
Mr. Gaddy.
Here.
Mr. Kelly.
Here.
John Curran.
Here.
Mr. Farrell.
Here.
Ms. Hennessy. Here. Mr. Iwan.
Here.
And Ms. Gaddy.
Madeline?
Madeline's here. I can't hear Petra, but I can hear all of you.
Oh, hi, Madeline.
All right. All accounted for. Thank you. We're glad to have members of our community here. Would anyone like to make any comments about what's on the agenda today? Alex?
Good afternoon, Alex Fernandez, 418 Snow Egret. I'm pleased to see that this item is on the agenda, Mr. Chairman. On many occasions, I have made the comment that Kiwa has ordinances that do not allow for me to have my bike overnight and be seen from the road, or that my beach chair also not remain overnight. If not, I would be fined. But Kiwa lacks to protect what I believe is the largest asset of Kiwa Island, and it's our trees. So I'm pleased to see that this is on the agenda. I would ask that please put this on a fast track so we can get this done. I'll tell you an incident back almost 2 years ago. One of the council members, who's Dr. The name escapes me, but he's, thank you. When he was on the council, I remember mentioning this to the council, and he said, "You got nothing to worry, Alex, because it's on our list of things to do." That's been close to 2 years. So that's why I asked to please put this on a fast track to get this done, because I do believe that the largest asset of Kiwa does need protection. So thank you.
Thank you, Alex. Anyone else? Okay. John, regarding new business, would you walk us through the draft of the tree ordinance?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm going to walk us through where we have come and where we are today, and then after that, I'll go exactly through each of the draft documents that have been worked on so far. So today is a workshop format. This workshop will look at specifically what's been now ran by a subcommittee established of the full Planning Commission group, a landscape and tree preservation ordinance for the town. We're going to focus primarily today just only on the tree preservation component, and then at a later date, we'll continue this process to bring back specific standards regarding landscape for recommendation to town council. But as far as what's being discussed today, we'll solely focus on tree preservation. So I just want to give just very brief overview or history of why did we seek to establish a comprehensive landscape and tree preservation ordinance. for many of existence of Kiowa, this particular standard has been relied upon through the Architectural Review Board in its birth with Kiowa for many, many moons. That entity has provided great care in setting the foundation of how Kiowa is designed with nature. And so fast forward to where we are today, this has been discussed in a couple now of our annual workshops with town council, that it's the appropriate time for the town now to consider our own tree preservation ordinance. And so that's the maturation of where we are as a community and now bringing those standards today. And as this moves forward, I'll clarify a few misconceptions that may be out in the community regarding this particular process. And so just to be, this is one of those that the town, even though we have the Kiowa Island Architectural Review Board, who has held most of the landscaping and tree preservation standards for Kiowa as a whole, the town does have the ability to create its own landscape ordinance. And so that's what the Planning Commission has been tasked to do, prepare and recommend for adoption to town council, just that. So are there current standards in our current zoning code that talk about tree preservation or landscape? There are a few standards within our zoning code today, but it's not a comprehensive approach to tree preservation or landscape. These are either coupled with development standards of additional uses, accessory uses in building, or compatibility buffer standards, as well as parking. So there are some things that speak to tree and landscape standards, but there's nothing in our zoning code today that's comprehensive. And so as part of this process, the Planning Commission I introduced this, I think, in April of this year, in March, April, just to show what's the benefit to the community of having our own tree preservation ordinance. We know that trees provide a substantial amount of benefit. In general, these are just some of those things that have been highlighted: habitat, shade, being able to be a sound barrier, of course, buffering from whether it might be incompatible uses, from a stormwater infiltration, screening, windbreak aesthetics, all the like. Here's an image, or a few images rather, that are been captured on the island that shows the intent of, at the end, once we are done with this particular process, what the goal is to really look at different areas on the island. So whether it's commercial, whether it's residential, or whether it's adjacent to a right-of-way, what might those standards look like? Whether those be specific landscape standards, and or how trees can be removed and or mitigated. So as part of this particular process, our Planning Commission, a subcommittee was created, and that subcommittee considered a number of elements related to what tree preservation ordinance would look like. And these are a number of things. As I stated at the beginning, we won't go into specific landscape standards, but we will focus on solely tree preservation. So at our future date, once we do get into more of landscape standards, you'll see some of these other elements that are listed on this list here that we'll begin to talk and discuss. The considerations during this process, really these are the things that the subcommittee focused on in its initial phase of getting started, and what things would be considered as important to a tree preservation ordinance and landscape ordinance. So first, knowing that the blueprint for Kiowa, as Kiowa has been developed, is this concept of designing with nature. And so being able to take that concept and move that forward throughout this particular element of landscaping and tree preservation was very important. Native plants, the town has for a number of years inserted this Grow Native effort. And so that has been another element that's been considered to ensure that we are pushing and advocating for native plants based on our environment, our wildlife habitat that likes that. Our comprehensive plan, as part of this process, eventually those things we want to make sure that it's looked upon and compatible. And then those other three things that are listed there are sort of natural things that are associated when you do particularly any process. So looking at how different areas might be unique. So one area of the right-of-way versus smaller lots versus larger lots, different types of trees, different types of shrubs. And then ultimately, once this is implemented, this will be something town council will consider of how we essentially build capacity to make sure that these standards are appropriately enforced. Then the last thing I kind of mentioned already was looking at how we look at our main areas, particularly the Keel Island Parkway, Beach Walker Drive, as rights of way. So as we got started, the thing to note is that there are a number of areas of expertise out there related to tree preservation and landscaping, which myself and our subcommittee, I didn't name our subcommittee, but our subcommittee, Dr. Ron Karn, Joanne Hennessy, and Larry Iwan of the Planning Commission. We met initially and just kind of began, and I think our first 2 meetings was like, this is pretty intimidating because it's a lot to undertake. And so we broke it out a little bit smaller sections at a time, and I think that's how we got through it. And so by the end of the day, after I go through each of the documents that are prepared, you'll see that eventually we do want to fold into this particular process the design professionals. We've reached out to in-house to provide comments regarding our environmental department and wildlife department. As part of this public process today, we've invited many stakeholders, and we'll also, by the time we get to actual formal recommendation, our public hearing, we would have also heard from our design teams, meaning landscape architects, maintenance companies, et cetera. So
John, sorry. You going to reach out to architects, or were they on the design team?
So we've had a few already reach out, just based on just them being very familiar with Kiowa processes already. But to incorporate a larger mass, we sent out a notice to all of anyone who's been registered architect or registered LA in the town's business, has a business license with the town. We sent them this information just so they have that opportunity to weigh in as a stakeholder.
Yeah,
Get any comments?
Not yet, but I would anticipate that we would receive some, hopefully, by the time we get to a recommendation.
I would think that'd be a great idea because, I mean, a big piece, especially in residential, is just the site clearing, the stuff inside the setbacks they're going to build on. So they're probably going to have views on what to take down, how to take down, how they can build around things inside the setbacks.
So initially we
great
were,
idea.
and our subcommittee kind of can add to it. We wanted to probably bring that into this initial phase, but as we got through this process, or at least I realized as staff that most people like something to respond to, opposed to just saying, hey, what are your ideas?
Yep.
And so I think this allows us for them to respond to something.
Great idea.
All right, so if there are no questions about process, like I said, this is built into 2 phases. The first phase would be just the tree preservation, and the second phase, we're going to more of the landscape standards specifically. If there are no questions about sort of where we've started and where we are today, I'll transition and go into the draft documents that have been prepared. So,
John, before you get into that, I've got a couple threshold questions. The first one being, I know we're doing all the review of all the ordinances. Why this one essentially being the first?
well, this has been on our staff's radar as sort of our annual ticketed items from our annual retreat, the tree preservation ordinance. It felt of the essence just because of the nature of the uncertainty of what might occur with the task force of the Architectural Review Board, and that has been established. This provides an extra layer of support. I think you can make the argument that this is the appropriate time for us when we have begun
So
to look at.
you're gonna make a recommendation, or you want a recommendation to go from this commission to the board or the council before we know what the status of the ARB slash council or town relationship is going to be?
Yeah, so those are independent.
The answer was yes, you want something to go before we know what's going to happen.
Yes, so the idea that subcommittee or the task force that was formed is looking at a broader picture of ARB tangents.
The broader picture is in here. You got a duplication of everything that's going on now in this ordinance, and we don't know whether it's going to be
Andy, we dealt with
necessary.
that. We dealt with that question.
what's the answer?
The answer is, we thought they were this will stand on its own, regardless of what happens with the ARB.
It can't stand on its own.
Yes, it
It's a
can.
duplication.
The town
It's a
has,
duplication
Andy,
of
listen,
what you go.
there's no duplication. It's going to be a regulation that whatever comes out of the ARB is going to have to, can't be any, could be more strict, but can't be any
Would
looser
you
than we
accept what
established.
they do?
It's they can do that if they want, but the town is going to have a
No,
line in
no,
the sand.
no. What I said is, will the town have to accept what the ARB does?
Well, I
Who's going to
can-
get it first?
I don't think the ARB
So
or anyone would want to have less restrictive ordinance. And I think the objective here is to take what's been done over the years, and with the help of our subcommittee and the many hours that they've worked on it, is just to make it that much better.
Andy, if I could say, we did discuss all this, and part of the problem is that we've been told, because we don't have a tree ordinance, if the ARB doesn't enforce the rules, there's nothing we can do about it. That, after the Cape and Parcel 13 were cleared without a site plan and stuff, but we had no recourse to do anything about it. Our subcommittee started on this back in March, and we feel it is, and chime in, guys, if you agree or disagree, but we feel that it is important for the town to have a tree ordinance so that if there is an issue with trees being cut down, we have the ordinance in place that we can actually enforce something. We can enforce mitigation. We can say, no, you can't cut that tree down. We don't have that right now, and that's the purpose of this, and it needs to get done.
Joanne, that is a narrative that I've heard with no basis. Well, the fact is, until we know what the ARB is going to do, you haven't even talked to the ARB, number one. The committee that's meeting with the ARB or with the KICA to talk about the ARB and the status won't even talk to the ARB. They want to develop a paper and release it so that they get their way and the ARB doesn't have a chance. The question is, let's cooperate. What are we doing here? Why are we setting up a standard now?
We're setting up a minimum standard. They can
You're
do it.
not.
Yes, we are. It'll be a regulation. It'll be the minimum
That's
standard.
everything that they're doing.
Fine, they can adopt ours, but it's the minimum that's going to be required.
I'm trying not to interrupt, but, I mean, I think, Andy, I think we all had that question initially. When we first started, we had that question. But town council asked us to proceed. Okay, so we didn't ignore that question, but we were told to proceed.
Right.
Okay, so we've done what they've asked us to do, and that's what this document is intended. So, I mean, we all had the same question back in February and
And
March.
what was the urgency at the town council? We heard yesterday.
We
Uh,
obviously
wait a
can't
minute,
answer that,
Larry,
Andy.
let me finish.
Andy, we can't,
Let me
obviously can't answer
finish.
that.
Let
Andy,
me finish.
All
Andy,
right, hey.
Listen,
Enough.
we heard yesterday from the council members themselves that they recognized that there was no hurry in dealing with some of the issues they were dealing with yesterday at this time. They recognized then they could wait it. This is the same issue. They're going to recognize now that they can wait if they think about it.
that's what the town council should tell us then, if that's your point. If they're the ones who initiated it, they're the ones who can slow it down.
Fine. You want me to, first of all, the overall comment on the ordinance is it's confusing from the standpoint of what's required for new construction and what's required for ongoing existing properties. But let me read something. It says in neighborhoods like, for example, in this case, homeowners could previously have up to a 15-month wait for periods to get things done like tree removal.
Andy,
Wait a minute, under the new system, and this is something I'm going to ask you in a second. Under the new system, property owners will be able to complete that type of work as of right, eliminating the need for city approval, town approval, and subsequently enabled city agencies to focus on larger development issues.
What are you reading from?
That is the thinking that should have gone into this.
What are you reading from?
I'm reading from an advance paper,
From where?
New York. And if New York can't be a standard setter for somebody in terms of thinking what is necessary and where it's coming from, I don't know who can.
I guess we
Well,
disagree.
John gave us, when we started this, he gave us tree ordinances from Hilton Head and where else, guys? He gave us a lot of things to look at.
Probably 6 different.
A lot of towns.
In terms of what your mission was, yes. In thinking about whether or not as of right makes sense, because we've heard nothing but complaints about the ARB relationship with the
So I just want
residents for
to, I
years.
just want to interject here. The conversations of procedures and process of the ARB is independent of what's being presented today. And so that town council is still wrestling with whatever outcomes are revealed from that particular process of evaluating the current practices of the Architectural Review Board. This particular ordinance that's being drafted and presented will fold into our zoning code just as if it was a setback, a height standard, or any other standard in our zoning code. And so with that, we would just add in a new tree preservation code, a tree preservation standard. Once once this is adopted, and I won't even say once it's adopted, I think town council at that time will make, I think, a decision of how this interfaces with what might be any outcomes of the Architectural Review Board as part of their approval process. But the recommendation from the Planning Commission, I would encourage that you guys just focus strictly on what these standards are as presented. Are these standards ideal for the town? Are they too restrictive, not restrictive enough? And should anything be added? But I would want you guys just to focus on what those standards are. That is staff's perspective that we should have a tree preservation and landscaping standards in our zoning code. That provides us additional protections outside of any other private entity from a governing standpoint. And so that's where we are today.
And you know, there's no other ordinance on the books that we need to get to before this.
So I mentioned in our last time that we will have a complete review of our entire zoning code. That has not been done in a number of years of our entire zoning code. There are a number of things that I believe that needs to be cleaned up in our zoning code, but to tackle that all at once is impossible. So this particular ordinance in tree preservation and landscaping, it is a need based on community support for that, and in addition, direction from town council.
John, and I appreciate the response, but yesterday was a little different response to the same question.
So I would
Now we're having a discussion about what we're being told to do as opposed to what is required to be done or what makes sense to be done. And I'm at the point now where I'm hearing things from basically the product that's going to council, that it being fed back to council because that's what they wanted. I don't think this commission is in place to decide what the council wants. It's in a position to make recommendations to a council based on need. What's the need here?
So
So John, if I may, and maybe this will end it, I hope. It's been whispered to me that there was a tremendous outcry about the Cape when they clear-cut the Cape. The town had no ability to respond to that. So this is a way in the future, with the site plans and the development, still a few parcels left, if they go in and clear-cut, we'll have the ability to respond, fine, make them plant new trees, prevent it from happening. But the Cape, the town itself had no ability to respond to that clear cutting. And that's a mistake. So in terms of priority, I think it's a high priority. I think it's a great idea.
I
But
think
that's
it's a
just-
great idea that clear cutting was permitted and has been permitted for the last 5 years or more. And the fact is, if you look around the island today, on houses that were clear cut, you can't tell. Maybe you're jumping ahead before you understand what the Cape is even gonna look like. You don't know what the remediation is.
I know what the Cape's gonna look like.
No, you don't know what the
I
remediation
do,
is.
I have the plan.
And, yeah, you have the plan now.
No,
How
I have
long
the
is it gonna
plan that
take-
goes to the bankers.
How long is it gonna take to grow the way it's supposed to?
All I'm telling you is, the town did not have an ability to respond and fine or stop. This will give us the ability to fine or stop.
So if
For
I
me,
can
that's a
just,
great priority.
if you don't mind, if I can just jump in. So this is, of course, a workshop, and you guys have already done some work to get thus far. And Mr. Fernandez is correct. This was on the town council, Dr. Scott Parker. It was part of Go Green Initiative, I believe, but it was just a discussion, essentially, probably since I've been here for 8 years, off and on, about the lack of certain things that we have in our ordinance. So we have finally have John in place. We have essentially the additional planning staff, so we have the resource and time. We would like for you all to have a discussion and then ultimately make a recommendation in terms of a tree preservation and landscape standards. This is not unusual for a lot of municipalities to have this in their ordinance. We don't have it in our ordinance. There's probably other things that we need to look at eventually to put in our ordinance. So at the end of the day, when you guys are all said and done with this, it could be something that will complement what the ARB standards has. It can be something that's more restrictive, but we need to start this process, and that's all that we're asking you all to do. And that's what council has asked over the last couple of years through our retreats. And so that's why we're here today. So really, we're just hoping that you guys start the process. We're not saying that what's presented today is the final product. We're just starting the process, right? So I'm hoping that we don't get into a debate and argument over it, but just kind of look through and say, what makes sense as a municipality? Because just like other jurisdictions, we could ultimately have our own ARB board. I mean, there's things as a municipality that we can have. And so that's all that we're asking you guys to look at is kind of start that process for us and work with John. And it sounds like that you're going to have some other expertise come in to help provide that guidance. So that's all that we're asking. So
Thanks,
If
Stephanie.
that's all we want. Comments on the draft, put it on the shelf until we understand what the status is.
Well,
and then
let's
make a recommendation.
let's just say this. So as planning commissioners, this is part of, in terms of the role and charter of planning commission. You guys are looking at this, you're doing the work, and we're very thankful that you guys are doing the work. You do the work, you give it to council. Council then can vote on it. Council can make the decision on how they want to handle it. They can say, yes, we want it part of our ordinance, a standalone ordinance, but ultimately, we're asking you guys to help John and the planning staff, help me put together some standards that council's been asking for the last several years so that we can get something to them and they can take a look and they'll decide from there how it should be enforced. But they're going to, of course, take you guys' recommendation, as a whole. I'm hoping it comes as a 7-0, but, it may not. But they would take your recommendations from you guys. So talking about putting it on the shelf and letting it sit, that would be a decision of council, but they are asking for you all to kind of start that process. Now, it could take us, 4, 5 months, 6 months before we even get something to council. We're not saying, expecting you guys to get something to them next month. So this is a process.
That's good to hear.
Yeah, I mean, it could be 3 months. I'm not saying that it could be that long, but I'm just saying, this is a process. Let you guys work through the process. Take however long you need, but work through the process. And when you're ready, collectively, then you will forward it to council for consideration.
If that's the case, that's fine, but we've heard today, we're going to have specialists come in, we've asked for comments, we have drafts that we just got, we have to go through those. We have a situation here that could put us in direct conflict with what's already being done. And until that's resolved, you can't make a recommendation that makes sense.
I'm not quite sure. So what I'm hearing from John is that he was just laying out kind of the next steps. And so just like, other things that you guys have worked on, it's a process. In terms of direct conflict, when we're writing our ordinance as a municipality, we will make sure that if you guys want to make it more restrictive than what's currently a private ARB, we do not enforce their private guidelines. So you all look at it and think about it from a public entity. What do you guys want us to be able to force. We don't want to make it less restrictive. You can make it equal, or you can make it more restrictive. But what do you want the town of Kiowa, as a municipality, what do you want us to look at when we're reviewing site plans? What do you want us to look at when it comes to tree preservation, landscape? What is it that you want our team to be able to review and look at? That's kind of what you guys are kind of going through the process today, is looking at what you want us to do, nothing related to the
We already
ARB.
have a tree ordinance, so
The town does not.
we have one now.
All right,
The town does
let's,
not.
Tree ordinance?
The town does not. The ARB, which is private, they're not part of the town,
And it's by reference, we're, okay,
but the town does not.
Okay.
fine.
Town
all
of
right, I'd
Kiowa.
like to put this train back on the track. I suggest we let John continue, and as you know, we always have a section for commissioner comments, so if each of us could hold our comments, you'll have a chance to share with them. And I'm also a believer that perfection is the enemy of the good. So we're not going to get something that's ironclad and perfect. Most important word in this whole document is the word draft. And that's what we're trying to accomplish today, is get a draft out first. And then if we find out 6 months, a year from now, oops, we missed something, then the next important word is amendment. And we'll go from there. So John, get us back on track, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I will go through this first. As part of this process, there's touch points, but the main particular document of this is what's being proposed now would be a new section in the code, section 12-129. So it first, as mirrors as any of our other ordinance, its purpose and intent. And so the purpose of these regulations is to provide tree preservation and landscaping standards for both existing and new developments in order to consistently preserve and enhance Kiowa's natural environment and to assure the continuance of significant and specimen trees and forests for present and future generations. And that intent is then listed by a number of things that are share essentially the benefits of why we're doing this. So looking at the natural character, protecting health and safety of residents, to prevent erosion or flooding, screen noise, dust, glare, maintaining aesthetic values, property values, and the promotion of native trees and shrubs. So that's the purpose of intent. I'll go through each of these sections. I won't necessarily read line by line, but I'll give a sort of overview of each of the sections, and then some of the touch points that once I'm complete, I think some of the subcommittee members can weigh in, and I think some things that we discussed, maybe bringing that to the full commission to weigh in on a little bit, or at least have some discussion on. So when we shift to the applicability and exemptions, this particular section tells who this ordinance applies to, and so, or what can be exempt from this particular ordinance. When we're looking at this particular section, this would apply to both residential and non-residential properties within the town of Kiowa, except where it's been duly noted here, if someone is pruning trees for regular maintenance, the removal of trees for vegetation for safe site distance and clearing, regarding visibility adjacent to right-of-ways, routine maintenance on golf courses, removal of trees for emergency work. So think about if there was a significant emergency where it might be post-storm or an event happened, that would be an exemption. The removal of invasive species, that's been outlined, and then also things that are associated with utility companies and infrastructure installation. There is also, as part of that particular process, have been outlined with that last one mentioning not just any utility provider can come in and automatically remove trees. The subcommittee did want to add in some level of scrutiny, or at least some level of safe basis of what would be needed or required for that utility company to be able to remove trees. So even though they're exempt, they still would need to provide And that you see here in the list of things that they'll need to provide in coordinating with the planning director to ensure that those things can happen as they install those utilities. So it isn't just a automatic, just because I'm a utility company, that I can just come in and remove trees.
So can I ask a question, Mr. Chairman?
Yeah.
So that one probably bothers me the most. Why would you exempt utilities except as long as they provide a plan? Why would you have them provide the plan, but know that you're going to give them an exemption? I would hate to see them just come in and cut off, big trees or big limbs off of live oaks.
So this
because-
is
just because they're exempt.
So there's a pretty common practice about most municipalities to give that flexibility or deference to utility companies. Infrastructure is a very critical point in the development process. And so that's the thinking of allowing some deference to those utility companies to be able to do significant work before things come online. So whether it's water, sewer, and without, it does provide some leeway for the town to have protection just in case it's, so it's more so of them establishing coordination up front opposed to giving them that ability to go unhandedly and do their job of providing that infrastructure that is needed.
Yeah, that's I guess my concern is, I think you're trying to do that, right?
Yeah.
The coordination, but it seems like you're exempting them, but then asking them to coordinate rather than saying coordinate and we'll give you an exemption. It's a subtle
So-
difference, but you see the difference?
Yeah, so what I would recommend then, as we go through this process, make some notes. If there's, and then once we get to the process of amending this draft, and then we can add particular clarity language. So just make some notes on any of the sections that I outlined.
Sorry, I'll hold my other comments.
No, I mean, it's good to have that, so I'm aware, so we're aware as staff what those concerns might be in the next iteration of this document.
And that section was discussed in the subcommittee as well, and John has rewritten it, I think to try to coordinate, but not make them go through the entire process.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we thought there was a timing issue, that if the utilities had to come in and do things, we didn't want to delay utility work for permits. But
Yeah,
there
that's
can be
kind of the common,
communication.
that's the kind of common thinking. Like I said, most municipalities have some deference to utility companies coming in and making sure that infrastructure is complete. And I don't use the word fast track, but fast track.
I'll save my comments, thanks.
So section 2 there is outlines required permit. And so this is just outlining a section that states that a permit now would be required. So it's one of the documents that you see prepared, which is section -162. Today, we added in that as an amendment, an additional amendment, that now tree removal will be a required permit in that list of things that are currently required as far as development.
Isn't that inconsistent with the first item?
What would be inconsistent?
Pruning the trees is exempt, but yet a permit's required?
So so if someone wanted to, it's probably a little bit further in the document, you'll see that once we get into some of that, but a permit would be required for tree removal. So if there is someone who wants to remove a tree, we would ask that they apply for a zoning permit. That's really what that section 2 is asking now.
Sorry, you're talking about just renovations or
Difference between
substantial
pruning, the
changes?
difference between pruning and removing a tree.
You're going to prune your trees every year, you need a
No, a
permit?
permit. You can prune anything you
why it's
want,
exempt.
but you can't, but if you're going to remove a tree, you need a permit.
So that exemption is
Remove
just for,
yeah,
that exemption
they
is
do
just
now.
for regular pruning. So we won't require a permit if you're doing regular pruning for annual, does that make sense? Okay.
Difference between pruning, and then we put we defined pruning,
We
we gave
put
a limit
some,
on the
we
number
put
of
some
branches.
meets and
that-
bounds on what pruning
It's
kind
there in the
of.
document.
Not even that so much, we also did the size of the limbs too, we
But
made
it talks
size.
about trimming, and you're talking about removal.
Yeah, so there is a difference that the subcommittee wanted to ensure that someone who's just doing regular pruning is not treated the same way if someone's actually damaging a tree by cutting it back too far.
On page 7, section 7, there's stipulations of what pruning.
Yeah, but how do you get back that far? You read the
You
first,
read-
first one,
you
it said,
read
oh,
the
I'm
whole
gonna do
thing.
I'm gonna do trimming
Well,
every year.
and that's why we talked about it in the first sections and said maybe we should put limitations on, but John put the limitations in section 7.
So
where it
what I'll
talks
say,
about
like I
how
said,
much-
if you guys can, if there's substantial comments, just make that note. If there's something about reordering it that makes it read more clearly, we can definitely make those changes. The things that you're listing are somewhat already in the document, so they might need to be reordered, but that's part of this process, that we can always, but I can get through some of this substantially. Oh, I didn't realize that, yeah. But it's not, oh, yeah, yeah. You get it. So I'm on page 2 at the bottom, of page 2. Let me do this, yeah. I'll try to better reference where I am. So as part of this section, you can see there that under section B, section A, that it requires now a permit. That section B now highlights when that tree can be removed after approval. And so these particular conditions that have been listed include now the tree that is dead, diseased, or damaged, hazardous or clearing damage caused to property or injury, trees that are determined by the planning director designee to be causing structural damage of greater than 200 square feet. The density of trees is greater enough that a removal of a tree would be beneficial to the overall area. The tree removal is part of a greater development plan, or that tree is being removed has been approved by the Board of Zoning Appeals. So you'll see as we move forward, those are really the instances of when tree removal can occur, and that's after a formal approval. Whether that be for an individual tree or part of the development process of someone having a new new home being proposed, they'll have certain requirements that need to be now submitted as part of their application process to include things relative to trees. And so you'll see now in section 3 that highlights that. Section 3 begins tree surveys, tree preservation plans, and landscape plans. And so now there would be a requirement that depending on the type of development, whether it's a renovation, new construction, and that renovation is minor or major, one or more of these things would be required by that applicant or property owner. And so the first one outlines what is a tree survey. That tree survey is essentially that's an inventory of what's on the site. And it has a list of things that we are asking that this be provided to the planning department as part of the application process. So a few things to note as part of this. It needs to be certified document, and it should have both the inventory of trees as well as topography and a number of things that most of our professionals already do as part of their development timeline and process today. If this particular property has OCRM critical area, then we ask that particular survey, or at least have information that the survey be certified within 5 years, and also identify any particular utility locations. The next category is a tree preservation plan, which we believe this is one of the integral parts of this particular process. So with that particular, with any particular new development, we know that trees are going to need to be removed. And so this just outlines, as something is being developed, these are the measures that are being taken to preserve or replace those particular trees on site. And so this is the landscape architect, arborist, design team really putting together a plan to show how they're going to preserve the trees on the site that we believe should be preserved or protected. That would include making sure that particular barriers are installed throughout the construction process, ensuring that this is also provided by a certified professional, And those right calculations are made based on DBH, or diameter, breast height, the number of trees that are listed on that survey, that are inventory, and the right calculations are made based on what we have in the mitigation section.
Can I make a comment?
Sure.
It's more of a secretarial comment and not contentious. So in section B3, so 3B, number 3, and you have it, you have the word significant. You have that twice in the document, and I think it should be protected. We don't really have a definition of significant. So you have, so that the fewest significant and specimen trees are destroyed or damaged.
Okay.
So both there in 3B, and also on page 8A, the word significant again, where I think it was meant to be protected.
Okay. Any other comments about that particular section there? Okay. So the next one, like I said, barriers will be required, and those barriers shown on that particular tree preservation plan. And that's at this, from the start of development to that, throughout that process, grading, et cetera, all throughout the development process. The next plan is a landscape plan, and that may or may not be required, just depending on, I'm on page 5 now at the top. That may or may not be required, just depending on the development type. And so that required landscape plan, today, as I mentioned earlier at the beginning of our workshop, eventually we will have landscape standards. And so those new standards that would be developed, we'll be looking to make sure that those are incorporated in this particular landscape plan. So dropping down to the bottom of page 5, you see now a new table introduced. And this new table is essentially what we're using to identify when one or two of those things would be required, or whether it's a tree survey, tree preservation plan, or landscape plan. For new construction, all three of those things would need to be provided as part of their application. One of the breakouts are renovations or improvements, and those are broken out based on substantial and minor. And this was something that the subcommittee, we had a lot of discussion around, and so maybe there's some comments that you all maybe want to weigh in based on how we've provided this so far. But substantial improvement, right now we're utilizing the definition of how we, in our building code, of anything of repair renovations of 50% or more of a value of the structure. And then minor improvement would be just those.
John, can you stop here a second, because we did talk about this a lot, and I thought we had sort of agreed that we shouldn't use the value of the house as the determinant, because this is a tree thing. So somebody may be doing some massive tree work, but if it's a $5 million house, it's not $2.5 million, so they don't need to do that. So I thought we were going to redefine.
So
I want to add, just to clarify, in the last session that we were in, we added a second sort of criteria, if you will, and that second criteria more so focused on whether or not the foundation or of that particular property was being impacted. So
to try to catch all the properties where we wanted
Footprint, I'm sorry.
a tree survey and a preservation plan. So we thought value as one way to catch those properties. Then, and the value is actually quite high based on a previous definition. We think that's inappropriate, 50%. That means any renovation has to be $1 million, basically. So we added two additional standards. So if the renovation has a certain value, we'll catch it, and they'll have to submit a tree survey and preservation plan. If the renovation has a change in the footprint of the structure, it will have to be, they'll have to submit a survey and preservation plan. And then the last way to try to catch all the significant renovations is that if a renovation requires removal of a protected or specimen tree. So we have 3 different criteria trying to catch renovations that will require a tree survey and preservation plan. Value, change in footprint of the structure, and lastly, if they require removal of protected or specimen trees.
Define a
so part of that is-
define a
so part-
renovation. I mean, you're talking about a renovation, you have, in the tables here, you don't talk about renovations, you talk about significance, and
Well,
it's
the-
table
again-
XX for,
This substantial improvement definition is in,
Yeah.
in the code, so we can't change that without changing prior.
So in that table there, I'm going to add some clarity here to help the conversation. Substantial improvement, that definition is essentially looking at renovations and repairs. So the word
but
improvement
then
is.
you said a definition, using that term, you said a definition of what that is, based on value. Then you throw the word improvement in there, in addition to it. What is an improvement?
So let me backtrack a little bit here to make sure I understand. So I'm going to say, first, if there's a property, a undeveloped site, we would treat that as a new construction.
You say substantial improvements or renovation can be found in table XX. Renovations is not in XX.
I'm gonna break it down so we have clarity here. So there's 3 tiers. There's new construction. That means that an undeveloped site now a new home is being proposed or a new development. Then there's a substantial improvement. That substantial improvement is if there are renovations being made to an existing structure based on value. That's where that 50% value. So that's what kicks it into the substantial categories is if 50% or more of the value of the structure. So that's an existing home already. And then anything under that would be minor. The main thing to really think about in this particular section is not penalizing someone if they're doing renovations to have to submit all 3 of these documents if they're really not impacting any trees or vice versa. So if they are impacting trees on a particular site, then we would want to have that information duly noted as part of the application process so that we ensure checking and
So you
balances.
need another survey.
Only if it's impacting the footprint of the home and it requires tree removal.
And it's
But if-
major,
No.
based on the value.
No. So substantial improvement require a tree preservation plan and a landscape plan.
So if
So-
I simplify it, if you want to use the word major improvement, minor improvement, opposed to substantial, that those words can be interchangeable, major improvement versus a substantial improvement. We just went with what's in the code today.
And use renovation as opposed to improvement.
John, what does it say in the current code?
Substantial improvement includes where repair or renovations cost is 50% or more of the
Tied
structure
this to, it's
value.
already in the code.
And
Yeah, that's construction.
That's
That's how you
defining,
measure the value.
that's defining a substantial improvement.
Fine, not a renovation.
Well, it's a play on words now.
Well,
So
you can do a
Mr.
renovation without
Miss-
having a 50% or whatever
If
the
there's
values
comment,
are.
if there's substantive comments, just make those notes of what would be wanting to be changed
The
in that
word
particular
renovation
section.
out.
Make
Say it
the
again?
suggestion to take it out.
Table.
Andy, make the suggestion to take it
Yeah.
out.
I did.
Okay.
I have again, more of a secretarial
But
suggestion.
you wanted to wait
I
till
don't
the end
think you
to get
need
all the comments.
footnotes in substantial improvement.
So if there's
'Cause those are-
minor, we can come
Okay,
back to that. I
sure.
want to really focus on what are like substantial things that
Okay.
are like really problems. So
No problem.
based on what I'm hearing today, to go back one more time on the substantial, rewording that is something that provides a more direct minor, major. Is that what your comment was, Andy?
It's a minor improvement, according to this, it's not required. You're talking
Correct.
about a
So
renovation.
if someone is essentially repairing windows or doing an interior renovation that has we're not requiring them to do any of
Agreed.
these things.
Take the word renovation out. You got it defined in the table as new construction or substantial improvement. And substantial improvement is what you've defined it as.
I don't see where it's
Not a
defined.
renovation.
We'll keep moving on.
We'll make those recommendations.
And then just to note, as part of this table, we added an additional discretion that at any time, the planning director could require that a landscape plan be provided, that if there's potential impacts that may be created for development. Section 4 on page 6, this now begins to look at the specific types of trees that we're wanting to preserve. So we have this really verbose introductory paragraph that talks about why the types of trees being specimen and essentially why they should be preserved, their value, their size. And then the second, letter B rather, this looks at what we identify as specimen trees. And these specimen trees have been identified based on essentially two types. Any tree that is over 24 inches in size, and that's DBH, we are identifying now as a grand tree. That's a common thing in most municipalities to have a grand tree definition, and then there's an additional one specifically looking at species of live oaks. And so anything 16 inches or greater in that species of live oaks, those two combined would be considered specimen trees. Based on this, those would need to be approved as presented right now by the Board of Zoning Appeals if they're being removed outside of that process of a specific development plan. So if someone's wanting to remove those trees, that would require the approval of a Board of Zoning Appeals for grant trees and that particular species of live oak. The next category.
Now, before you get to 5, back to 4, you have, again, you have a discretionary item in there, up to the discretion of the Planning Commission. A plan may be required for any improvement, again, which has been determined to create a potential impact for a minor improvement. What is that? What are you saying?
So I'm saying if someone is developing a site and it does not meet one of those thresholds, but there appears to be a potential impact, then I have the discretion to require a landscape plan be provided.
I'm talking about an existing site. You
Same.
improve
So
existing
whether it's
sites.
existing or whether it's a new construction,
fine.
that clause just says that the planning director has the discretion to require a landscape plan.
Tell me how it applies to an existing, again, minor improvement, how it applies to an existing property.
So we have quite a few of these examples that come before our Board of Zoning Appeals today.
One.
So where there's an improvement where someone is making an addition to their deck or rear deck or some of that nature, it's not a substantial improvement, but it does trigger a variance. The particular process now and how it's been administered, if it's a potential adverse impact to maybe an adjacent property owner, the Architectural Review Board typically would already require a landscape plan. And as staff, we particularly would follow what that outline has been in requiring a landscape plan. Most of the design teams during our initial pre-application meeting, we point that out to say, hey, throughout this process, you might want to consider adding an additional plantings or buffers on this particular project to lessen the impact. And so what this is doing is just putting it in writing of a particular practice that I'm already doing as staff, recommending that, hey, this may create a potential impact inverse to an adjacent property owner. And so this would help mitigate that up front.
Again, you're talking about minor improvement that you don't need permits for. You have the judgment to tell them to go ahead and do something?
It's discretionary, so it's just that what it is. So it may not be required, but it's discretion.
A homeowner can't operate with somebody else's discretion. You've got to understand what you're able to do.
So there are a list of categories that are not discretionary, which we've outlined, those things that trigger a required document in those first 3 things.
You say it in the very table, minor improvement not required. And here you're saying for a minor improvement, you have discretion.
But it's not required with a footnote of 4 to tell you to read the footnote if that gives him that discretion.
Yeah,
If that is creating an impact. So
inconsistency.
it's not just me having the authority
level
to
of
put
additional
in
scrutiny.
any requirement. It's adding a level of protection for potential impacts.
I mean, minor improvement could be a renovation that is literally $1 million.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's
Sorry, what?
50% of the value of the home.
Less than 50.
So it could be 999,000.
If it's,
I mean, for a $4 million home, it can be up to $2 million.
right.
So,
Let's-
so
what
the
the
word
code is
minor
now.
is somewhat of a,
Let's not wordsmith this. Some of
Right.
us have dinner before 9 o'clock tonight. John, please continue. And if we have questions, write them down. And it can be one question or 100 questions. Write them down, and we'll get to that later. But we need to move on, folks. We've got our local residents here that have given us their quality of time to be with us. They don't want to hear us going back and forth. Please, John.
All right, so that second, or not second, letter C under section 4 is that next tier of trees that are outlined as being protected. And so those would be, again, require approval. These are any of the trees with a DBH of 8 inches or greater, and that's within any required buffers or required landscape areas. And then any tree with a DBH of 12 inches or greater outside of the buildable area. And so what this is attempting to do is really look at where the footprint of development occurs and giving that flexibility, but those particular areas of buffer or setbacks, we want to preserve as many of those trees as possible. Section 5, beginning at the bottom of page 6, begins the introduction of native species. When we discussed this amongst the subcommittee, this was something that we relied on Jim Jordan, our town wildlife biologist on staff, who's been instrumental in our Grow Native plant database. So we've utilized existing databases. One would be our own Grow Native plant database, and the other would be looking at section 6 when we talk about invasive species, those provided by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, as well as Clemson Extension, who does work in that area. And so we just highlighted that it's important for us to consider native, and you'll see in the mitigation section the requirements for native species. Section 7.
John, this is tangential. Did you guys talk about the mandatory removal of invasive species at all as part of this?
It is listed in here that it is I forget which section, but there is a clause in here that says upon site development, if there is invasive species, those should be removed.
Apologize,
Yeah,
I missed that.
I can't remember which section it is, but it is in here. Section B, right there, 6B. Submitted landscape plan should not indicate the use. These species should be removed during the site development process if existing on the property. Tree removal. So this is section 7. This clearly defines what tree removal exists. So most times when we think of what tree removal is, it's really someone cutting down a tree. This actually provides a list of things that we would consider what tree removal is. And so that would be, to the point earlier, if someone is damaging a particular tree, causing health to that particular tree, if this is someone doing more than what we would identify as pruning, and this would be more than 25% of the leaf surface, significant branches that have been identified of 6 inches or greater, and damaging the root zone of a particular tree. These are all things that would be constituted as tree removal. And that next section, section 8, now begins the introduction of what mitigation requirements for replacement trees as part of this development process that are now created as part of this ordinance. So this table outlines on the far left-hand side types of trees, and then the location of trees in that next column, what would be the preservation requirements in this third column, and then the final would be what would be required to be mitigation. So we've broken these down into two categories. One, those if post-occupancy, if there's someone has an existing site and they just want to be able to remove a tree for some reason, these first 3 rows are the standards that they would look to see what requirements and mitigation requirements there. So beginning with grand trees and those specimen trees identified, these are those live oak 16 inches or greater across any particular portion of the site. Those are prohibited from being removed except with the approval by the Board of Zoning Appeals. The mitigation requirements, so as part of this, the BZA now would have conditions in place that their mitigation requirements would be to replant trees with a minimum combined DBH equal to 100% of what's being removed. And then 70% of those, we're asking that those be native species on the replant. Looking at areas outside the buildable area that are 8 inches or greater, similar, that removal would be prohibited except approval by the planning director in accordance additionally with required mitigation standards. If you notice that far right-hand column, the mitigation requirements are all the same. So replanting of those trees of 100% DBH of those removed, and then 70% native species. The additional category is us looking closely to more softer edges towards our critical area and ponds, lakes, dunes, etc., marshes. And this is only on the highlands. We're not discussing anything that are below the critical line. These would be only things on the uplands. Those would be also required to be approved by the Board of Zoning Appeals, and those mitigation standards also are listed.
John, it's Madeline. Can I ask a question?
Yes.
Currently, without this ordinance in place, is the ARB responsible for all of this oversight?
Yes, we do not administer a tree removal standard. So all tree removals are today administered by the Architectural Review Board.
And are these standards that you've set forth consistent with the ARB's standards right now?
There might be a few areas of a little bit more restrictive, but most of this ARB has what I would call more discretionary based on the site development. These are pretty one-to-one, meaning it's looking at one instance, one preservation requirement opposed to a holistically site development plan out for individual tree removal. For the removal of, I haven't introduced the second component is where I would say that probably mirrors more of what the Architectural Review Board does today, of looking at the entire site, which areas of the site might be more special than others, which trees should be preserved. I think that is what would be considered in that tree preservation plan that is required by the Architectural Review Board.
Okay, thanks.
So in this table, you use in the middle column, it's in accordance with the tree preservation plan. So in a different area, we've had requirements of who would need to submit a tree preservation plan. So a tree preservation plan is from the last table, who needs to submit a tree preservation plan.
Correct.
So somebody who's asking the planning director to remove one tree is not going to submit a tree preservation plan.
That you're correct. So we may amend that. So maybe it doesn't say.
You're just talking about this entire document in accordance with this document.
Yeah, more than so. Yes.
Because
That's
I think
yeah.
it gets confusing if you use that. Makes it sound like you're going to make them submit a plan.
Didn't we also just put in to say use of work, John, planning director or designee, that you could designate someone to do this as well?
I think
Have
that
that in there, or can you just designate?
we had that section we had that clause in another section ordinance. I think think it's understood that it could be whoever the planning director designates, so I don't
Yeah,
think it
that
needs
was
to be.
in an earlier
Yeah.
section. And I have a suggestion that, that for the middle column, protected trees, that maybe consider a footnote that the request must be accompanied with supporting documentation from an arborist.
You're saying any removal of,
So protected trees, that if they're going to request removal of a protected tree, it's going to come to you, that request should be accompanied with supporting documentation from a certified arborist.
well, I have a little bit of hesitation because sometimes this would be just based on the design professional. So you're just saying it's,
So we said, when we sat in our meeting, we said, what are the circumstances where somebody's going to be removing a protected tree that haven't been covered because the tree's diseased or dying, or, I mean, we've got that all covered in another area. So this kind of comes down to, what is the purpose
Okay.
of removing protected trees? It's not for building. This is an individual tree removal request. So it's not for building, it's not, so what would be the circumstances that we haven't already covered in earlier sections? And, the only one that we can really think of is for sight lines, which we don't want to permit.
that would be something we would write down to make sure we pose that question to some of the design professionals. But I noted that adding in
Yeah, I mean,
certified
I
arborist there.
think we want
Yeah.
to have something in there so that you can approve it, so it doesn't, but, so if there is a special circumstance, that it is something that can be approved. But we can't really think of many circumstances where we want protected trees cut down.
Yeah, I would always give that to the property owner to figure out whatever reason, and then we're responding to that. So I
Right.
agree. Okay.
Well, in that previous section where you did lay out those, almost every one of those had required permit. So every one of these has in section 2B, all of them have that you want documentation by an arborist.
Right.
So similarly, I think you'd want it in this set of circumstance, for this table as well.
So the other group of categories is not just not us just looking at a single tree removal or post occupancy. This is like in the process of site development. So the areas outside and that far, we're looking at protected trees outside of the buildable area. Those are full preservation of all protected trees is required in all of the front, side, rear yards, except for required permitted driveways, roads, easements, et cetera. The mitigation requirements there are listed the same. Specimen trees within the buildable area as well as, well, I'll stop there. Specimen trees within the buildable area, those require BZA approval. Remember, those specimen trees are really our greatest significant tree, those grand trees and live oak species. And then the third tier there is trees within the buildable area that are greater than 12 inches. Those can be approved by staff. And then essentially we have the only difference in that third category is that the mitigation requirements drop down to 70% opposed to 100% because this is within the buildable area. And then again, we added the same notions of trees adjacent to critical area. There is a note as part of section that we have for preferred tree density. So this just means when we're looking at these tree preservation plans and that's being submitted, to make sure that there's a substantial amount of trees per acre or DBHs, inches per acre. That is like a preferred tree density. So it's looking at a holistic site. The beginning of, or underneath that particular table, you'll see just some additional standards related to mitigation. So for example, one of those listed there is that any required mitigation trees or not to subsidize any required planting trees that are not part of tree removal. So if there's trees required by another section of the ordinance, those mitigated trees shall be in addition to. The other is the sort of diversity of trees being planted, which we've outlined that there should be a diversity of trees, so not just one type of tree. No single planted species can be more than 40% of that total landscape particular plan. And then what you've looked now in the section F sort of breaks down even a greater diversity category of looking at the number of trees and the minimum different types of trees.
The one question to the specialists, to the experts, would be whether that section C, mitigation trees, so for some of our native species, is it realistic that we're going to be planting live oaks that are greater than, or magnolia trees that are greater than 6 inches in caliber?
Yeah, so that's something I think we would want some additional feedback on.
Yeah, I mean, because like I said, those are some pretty large trees to be planting.
Moving on to page 10, there's a section there that just talks about tree canopy, and a lot of this might actually be fleshed out a little bit more during the landscape section or phase of this particular ordinance. But just as a breakdown now that most municipalities have a ratio of palmetto trees not being the equivalent of your standard canopy tree. And so that's just a ratio saying that 3 of those trees would be equal to that canopy tree. Section J is one that we kind of talked about a little bit in length. So we know that with tree mitigation, the site may get tight, and so there might be not enough room to replant all of the required mitigated trees. And so this section attempts to rectify that by allowing some discretion of where these trees could be planted elsewhere. Right now, it's being listed that this would be coordinated with the planning director, public works director, and other island entities. So right now, it's being suggested that maybe it's an adjacent open space, maybe it's a right-of-way enhancement, maybe it's an adjacent property owner who's willing to be able to provide additional space to enhance their property. And so that's just an alternative for mitigated efforts if trees won't necessarily fit on a particular site. I know there was a lot of discussion that we did not include about where most municipalities will introduce a tree mitigation bank, where folks are essentially donating into a fund, a tree fund, and that tree fund would be able to utilize to plant trees across the town's limits. That was not included in here based on our governance structure here, having a private gate and the difficulty it is to utilize those funds if the town is managing those funds to go anywhere to plant those trees. So right now it's built in really loosely as sort of a coordinated effort. And maybe that's one of the things, as mentioned, Mr. Chair, maybe at a future day we kind of see how this operates, and if we need to amend it, we can amend it in the future. That next section, J, just talks about the guarantee of trees. We know as trees plant, sometimes they do die within a very short time of them being planted, and so this is just ensuring that for 1 full year that those trees should be guaranteed after planted. We're getting near the end, which the last 2 sections here talk about the administration violation inspections. Right now, we know that sometimes, depending on the time of year, the availability of different species or plant types is a problem. And so this attempts to at least provide some relief to when those trees or plants can be installed. So if a particular plan is improved and those particular tree types are not available, maybe it's being able to switch out for a different species. That's just trying to build in some relief there. The last particular section addresses just violations. If there's a violation of a tree removal, what occurs? Right now, and it's being cited to our existing code and the violations there. There's been discussions of introducing a particular tree fine per tree, and I can have you guys weigh in a little bit there and your thoughts on what might be particular violations. But right now, it points to all of the available options today and as a violation under our current code. So there's only three more things that I'll go through very quickly, which are the tangential related ordinance that would be amended as part of this process. So one, we would need to update our site plan review as well as our zoning permit section, which is 12-162 and 12-165. 12-162 just adds in that now as part of site plan review, we would require particular those tree surveys, tree preservation plan, or landscape plans as required. And then zoning permits under 1265 would add tree removal as one of those things that would require a permit. Section 12-374 is our definition section. There are a number of things that we would add to our current code or redefine as definitions that have been introduced, and so that's just to clean up our existing definition sections. There might be a couple more. There are a number of things that you might see that this list is short.
Definition. Weren't we going to include an exhibit of you had sent us some stuff on what the invasive species are by definition? And I guess we don't need to define specimen trees, but we have one of the guys who came to talk to us, we talked about using somebody's chart for what are the invasive
So
species.
that listed we listed that in section, I just need to add in the specific
Just
reference
add it.
title document, but it's added in section 6 there. It talks about invasive species that will rely on existing list that's not creating our own. So page 7,
Okay,
page
right,
7.
the U.S. Department of Agriculture or list provided by Clemson, so we'll just, okay, as long
Yeah.
as we have some.
Yeah, I'm going to get the official title of that list to make sure that's correct, but essentially we're referencing outside document or existing documents. Mr. Chair, that is all I have in my intro. Like I said, the only thing I will note is this is a process. We want to make sure that we do get all of the right stakeholders in to weigh in on this particular process. This is something new for Kiowa, so we do want to make sure that we get the right input and feedback on this particular ordinance. But that's, I don't know if you want to open up for discussion or.
Well, why don't we have the public comments, stick with our agenda, and then we'll have the commissioners' comments.
Okay.
Thank you, John, for going through that. Anyone, any residents like to make any comments on what they've heard so far? Amanda?
Amanda Mole, Kiowa Partners Chief of Architecture and Design and Chair of the Kiowa ARB. Thank you for all the time and effort y'all put into this. The goal of designing with nature is always a good one. Really appreciate that that is what is at the heart of what you're trying to accomplish. I would like to caution against crafting ordinances that potentially create numerous non-compliances or non-conformances, because there are a lot of homes and currently on the island that would not comply with what's being suggested today. So just keep that in mind, as well as it's always not a good thing to create an ordinance that has frequent variances associated with it. So what we do have some comments from the ARB that we would really, we'll just share written comments. I think they're really too numerous to kind of go through right now, but we would like to continue the dialogue with John and the subcommittee, and we will like to assist with the refinement, and we'll provide those comments.
Thank you, and we would appreciate those comments. Thanks a lot. Anyone else? Okay, let's move on to commissioner comments, and Dr. Curran, we'll start with you.
Well, I pointed out to John prior to the meeting that there's some discrepancy in the definition of protected tree. On page 6, there's a definition of protected tree, and then in the terms to be defined, there's a different definition of protected tree. And I just curious what the commissioners feel. One is more inclusive, one is less. And in the terms to be defined at the back, it's any tree 8 inches or greater prior to development, or all trees in buffers and required landscape areas, so tree of any size. So in that definition, you would include many more trees in the definition of protected tree compared to the definitions on page 6, where it really just either 8 inches in a buffer area or 12 inches outside the buildable area. So like I said, I guess do we want to be more inclusive and designate more trees as protected, or do we want to be less inclusive? And then one thing that, again, that John and I spoke about was the footnote for the table, the second table, that footnote is really to assist John and the BZA with criteria that they can use to evaluate requests for tree removal for construction and site development. And John kind of briefly mentioned that there were 2 criterias. One is that any development, that the goal for any development would be the preservation of at least 50% of the existing trees on the lot. And then a second would be that following any development, that the minimum preferred tree density would be 20 trees per acre, or a combined tree DBH of 160 inches per acre. So that was really the purpose of the footnote, was to assist the planning director and BZA with some criteria, preferred criteria for tree preservation.
Appreciate that.
That's it.
Joanne?
This has not been a rush job. We started working on this back in the winter. Ideally, we were supposed to have it ready for a second reading by this month, but other priorities came along and we didn't get to it. That's no reason to slow it down now. I agree with what Mr. Dowdy said, that let's not let the perfect be the enemy of the good. This is a good ordinance. I think if all the comments that were made here to make some really minor changes, there were no major changes, that we can get our next draft, that we can put something together, that we can refer to the town council. They have asked us for that. They continue to ask for it. The community wants it, and I think it has been far too long time coming. I'd like to get it done. The other thing I'd like to ask is, we have a mitigation section. I know there was talk about mitigation for all those big trees that were supposed to be replanted and that died at the Cape, and I know the public would love just to have a public answer of whatever happened to the mitigation there. Was there mitigation done?
Good point. Is that it? Madeline, comments?
Thank you. Excuse me. Number one, I've read through this 2 or 3 times now and want to compliment John and the subcommittee on what I found to be a really fine draft. Couldn't find a whole lot of things that I had questions about, and those that I did, John has answered over the last hour. There were 3 things that I thought not to necessarily deal with today, not at all, but just to keep our mind on, and they came under primarily factors for Kiowa to consider during the process. With respect to Kiowa Next, how might changes with the town's comprehensive plan impact these standards? I would like to go a little bit further on getting some answers to that question. And then secondly, under the enforcement, what measures should the town take to ensure enforcement? I think that that's starting to be addressed in the inspections and violations section. But I think, well, for my purposes, I'd like to have a little bit more detail around that one. And then the last point was that there certainly appears that there will be additional workload created for both the planning staff and the BZA. And just something to keep in mind, how are we going to accommodate that? Otherwise, again, I commend the group on what I think is a really, really good effort.
Thanks, Madeline. John, I think you're going to make a point.
Yeah, I was just going to comment, one of those things in that you noted as far as next steps, building capacity, this is a new ordinance requiring a lot more maybe standards for review, additional resources. And so that would be, once we get to a recommendations stage, I'll ask you guys to also put as part of your recommendation to council the considerations for what might that be. So if that's additional requirements for staffing to build capacity to assist with this, that's something that town council has looked in as part of many recommendations. For the BZA, that would require additional training, because this is something new that a new ordinance, and so just training to make sure that they understand what they're asking, the different requests for tree removal and those criteria. So I understand those things that you've shared, Ms. Kay. Yeah.
Thanks.
Thanks, John. Larry?
First of all, I think the subcommittee want to really give a call out to John on the work he's done. I mean, we put some time in, but John he gave it he did a great job. Secondly, we were given a job and we're almost done getting it done. And we really encouraged everybody to take a look, send us your feedback, and I guarantee you we're motivated to get it done. So get it to us, and we'll make sure that it's considered and reviewed. And third, I knew that Ron was a surgeon, but I didn't think he was a tree surgeon. But apparently, he's developed some additional capabilities. Ron,
I knew nothing about this until a year ago.
yeah, he was all over it, man. He was all over it. So that's all I had.
Luke?
I, like everybody else, want to commend John. This is a very nice job. And the task force, super for getting this close to closure. A couple of comments. I've got some feedback from some architects where there's concern about how much time this is going to add to the process. There's been estimates around 6 months to a year for this. It seems long to me since I'm going through a renovation process myself. But I think we ought to have some concern about trying not to extend the time and making sure things overlap. There's a place in here where we talk about the ARB and the planning director looking at this. I'm a little concerned about what there's differing opinions on what the outcome should be. I think that can be resolved. I was really glad to see the intentionality around the differencing between new construction, minor improvements, and major improvements. That was very well received by me. I think we should solicit more feedback from property owners, and maybe some architects too, you mentioned. I think we ought to have some intentionality around seeking out property owners who've either been through new construction or been through renovations and seeing what their input would be. There's some other architectural comments that I think the architects will give us, but there's some, I think, needed flexibility for the site plan or the site plan around detached versus attached buildings. And I know there's numbers around like 1,500, 4,500, but for larger lots, it seems easier. It might be harder for smaller lots, but there's something around there. Also from architects, they had strong agreement with the strong buffers on the neighborhood side and on the street side, they were less in agreement around providing buffers, or more importantly, allowing openness for people who had golf course, ocean, or marsh views. So they didn't necessarily want to think that was, but people paid up for marsh views, paid up for ocean views. We shouldn't require them to plant trees to block those views. And then the last thing is, it seems like we're going to have to hire somebody, because you're not going to be able to do your job and do all these approvals. So is that something that's in the plan? Have we thought about that? Is it one person? Is it more than one person to administer this? But again, great job, super start, and hopefully we'll get more comments from the public.
Thanks, Luke. Andy?
I would not disagree that it's a start. I think one of the major issues that I have with this is the inability to distinguish how the proposed ordinance applies to existing properties as opposed to new properties or new builds on a property. And I think you got to make it clear, and you've got to separate it within the document itself. Otherwise, people are going to be encouraged, frankly, in situations where you're already in a established house on a location that's been through a process, has its approvals, and you're down the road years, maybe more than one. Your incentive under this regulation would be to do nothing in your yard. Just stay away. Because if you look at this, it's so draconian without the understanding that you can do something to maintain your yard. You ending up paying for a certified arborist to come in. You're dealing with understanding of issues. We had a chance here, I think, when I say we, the town had a chance here in this exercise to come up with something that was meaningful to the residents. Everybody wants to satisfy comments from the community. Well, one of the biggest comments you've heard over the years consistently has been the complexity, the time, and the cost of dealing with the ARB. Now, what you've got here is a set of standards that's very close to what the ARB is, if not exact. And what you've duplicated is exactly the problems that people have been yelling about for years. You haven't solved a thing. Now, one of the things I think that it's clear that you've created another level of complexity. You're talking about something called a zoning permit. Zoning permit. You're talking about a permit. Permit for construction is obtained. Well, then you talk about a zoning permit. So you got another stop. You've added more in the process. It looks like, to be honest with you, it looks like the way the federal government is writing regulations today. I wrote a regulation with the Labor Department, and I'll tell you, the law said very little. This is the law. You've got every situation you can think of covered, and people aren't going to react to it. They're going to ignore it. That's what government regulations today are forcing. People ignore them. And also, to talk about issues without separating the fact that you got property owner rights, you've got the right to protect your own property in a way that satisfies what the individual wants as opposed to what the government wants. You're telling everybody how they have to trim their trees, when they have to get a certified architect to come in. If I'm in the house 20 years, I'll do what my neighbor does. He hasn't had a tree surgeon in there or a tree landscaper or a tree trimming person in there for the whole time I've been here. And this will not encourage him to do it. In fact, it's just the opposite. I think as a minimum, you got to start by separating new and old, and then work from there. But make it clear that it's separate, not that it's overlapping. And don't give anybody permission to walk in. You're inviting trouble if everybody has the right to walk onto your property to do what they want to do, when they want to do it. And that's what some of this stuff says. I think you've got to really think through this, the language in here, to understand what you're asking for. And I'm not criticizing the task force. I'm saying that you come at this thing with somebody telling you you've got to do this or you got to do that in a certain amount of time. You haven't had the ability to get the input. You still haven't gotten the input in today's session. I think you need 3 or 4 more sessions today to get input. You can't expect this to go anywhere in the condition it's in. I mean, I'll give you one example, and it's a minor example, but it's fact. You define key terms, right? It's the homeowner, and Ron may have figured it out as a doctor, not that he's got tree credentials, but DBH, what does that mean?
It's a standard term.
To who? Standard to tree people and standard to architects, not to homeowners.
I think it's defined in the.
It's not defined in
In the
there.
document.
It's not defined in the document. It's not under key terms.
It's in our existing code. That's probably, I should have probably included all definitions that might be tangent related, but
I'm using that as an example of what you've got to do, and think about going, when you go through this regulation, understand it in terms of who your audience is.
I think it's important like we've done with other ordinances that have been passed. Particularly at our new flood ordinance or noise ordinance that we've done, where we brought in design professionals, we brought in contractors and explained this is what the new ordinance would be, just as any educational tool. So we can add that in full as part of this process to make sure that we're educating both homeowners and design teams the expectations once this is adopted.
Thanks, John. Okay. Well, I'd like to thank the community that gave us their afternoon. As regardless whether you're here or whether you're viewing online, thank you. And at this time, I'd like to have a motion to adjourn the meeting.
So moved.
Second?
Second.
We're adjourned.
So, Bill, are we going to have another meeting? Or are we going to have a special call meeting?
The one that John's talking about.
This isn't the topic for